The Falcons' downfall in 2025 had more to do with an underperforming roster than underperforming coaches.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And of course, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are going to take a deep look into why the Falcons roster is overrated and why their coaching in 2025 is not nearly as bad as many think it is. And in conclusion, we'll talk about, the additions that this team, in addition to building in the trenches, that they're going to need to improve their weapons if they want to sort of change the narrative from these past few years. But, this conversation stems from 2 comments I got on yesterday's episode where we broke down the bridge quarterback options with Joe Flacco here on YouTube. And the first comment comes from PT Cornelius 7018. He says, "We do have a loaded roster. Why are you even a Falcon fan, bro?" And then Rodney Do Funny 3129 said, "You have done no analyses on last season. Just throw something out there and start talking." So let's talk about PT Cornelius first. And I always get this question of, being a fake Falcon fan. Fans always love to gatekeep, right? It's that us versus them, whether it's us being Falcon fans, them being Saints fans, but that mentality is pervasive where it's like, well, I'm a real Falcon fan and you're a fake Falcon fan. For years, I've always had, because I base my takes off of film and evidence and stats and data and all this stuff. It's really hard for people to kind of poke holes in the arguments and opinions I have here on the podcast. And so they typically result in ad hominem attacks. And so therefore, like, you're not even a real fan. So they always try to attack your credibility. I'm used to it at this point in time, but at the same time, it still is like, okay, like, we're still doing this after 20 plus years, but it is what it is. So, to Rodney Do Funny's question or comment, and I think he meant analysis as opposed to analyses. We have done analysis on last season. We did that with the positional reviews, 2 weeks of shows, that was all about breaking down 2025. But, we broke it up in what we thought were consumable chunks by breaking it down by position, as opposed to just kind of meandering all over the place over the course of 2 weeks. But I'm going to do what you recommend me do, Rodney. I'm just going to throw something out there. It's going to be a spicy take of the day, and it's also going to push back against PT Cornelius's initial comment. I think the Falcons roster is overrated. I think their coaching is underrated, and that runs counter to the narrative that I'm sure many of you believe and have been hearing for months, if not years. And I know a lot of you guys will dismiss this as, oh, that's just Aaron being contrarian as usual. But oftentimes my contrarian takes that are deemed contrarian often, not always, but often, wind up being right in the end. And yet people still think I just say things just to say things, just to be different and whatnot. And, the narrative is that the Falcons coaching ruined their 2025 season. I don't think that's a false narrative, but I do think it's overrated, right? That if we're going to blame one thing on Raheem Morris's downfall here in Atlanta, not just in 2025, but his 2 years, I think the one thing, the number one factor, and again, not the only factor, but the number one factor, is that he had far too much confidence in Terry Fontenot's roster. We've talked about the complacency and all that stuff. Now, I say that this is not meant to suggest that the coaches shouldn't have been fired. This is not meant to suggest that the coaches did an incredible job in 2025, right? This is a results-based business in the NFL. They did not get the results, and so therefore they are no longer employed by this football team. And I think that is 1,000% justified by their dismissals. But I do think this notion that the Falcons have this loaded roster, as PT Cornelius would say, and I'm sure many others would argue, as they have yelled at me at various places, that the coaching is such a huge problem for them, I think is misleading and misguided. I think it's a coping mechanism. I think this is a coping mechanism that our fan base has been using for the better part of a decade. And I'm sure if we all got into a room with a sports therapist that could really get into the nitty gritty of why we think the way that we think and why we believe the things that we think, we would get therapized. And instead of that therapist going like, tell me about your mother, they'd be like, tell me about 28-3. And a lot of these coping mechanisms stem from that. But we're not going to get into that. Again, I don't get paid enough money by Locked On to sit here and therapize. So my spicy take is I kind of think that the coaching delivered what is a reasonable, if not realistic, expectation based off of the talent level of this roster in terms of winning roughly 8 or 9 games, right? And I feel like the last 5 years, the last 8 years, we've had this narrative of how great this talent is, and all we need is the right coach to unlock it, or the last 5 years has really been the right quarterback to unlock all this talent. And that narrative has been proven false over and over and over again. And the difference between us is many of you guys still hold to that narrative. You still believe it's true, and I don't. I'm like, oh, that has been proven over and over again to be a false narrative. And we're going to break down why I think this. And I'm sure many of you guys will disagree on that. That's fine. The goal of today is not for you to change your mind on what you think. The goal is for you to understand where I'm coming from on this, because you are listening to my podcast rather than vice versa. And, we live in a world on the internet where the internet is often black and white and the real world is shades of gray. And even though 100% of you guys are consuming me right now, whether you're watching this or listening to this podcast via the internet, we try to have this podcast live in the real world. But, a great example of how the internet works is, when someone says, what's the old joke of like, someone says, I like waffles. And then someone responds like, oh, well, you're saying you hate pancakes. And unfortunately, that's going to be how a lot of people are going to consume today's episode and being like, oh, you think this, and so therefore you think this other thing. It's like, no, I don't think that other thing. You just misinterpreting all the things I said. So without further ado, let's get out of the preamble and let's get into why I think the Falcons coaching was not nearly as bad as we'd like to tell ourselves, and how a lot of their issues, if not most of their issues last season, are owed more to deficiencies on the roster, and why I think if you are going to blame one thing for the failures of 2025, it would be those deficiencies specifically at the wide receiver position. And we'll break all that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it is draft season, and yes, the combine is coming up, but we're not talking about NFL draft. We're talking about the 5-hour energy flavor draft, breaking down some tasty flavors, which are the best, which might be those sleepers, right? The board is set, the flavors are ready, and only one can take the top spot. And 5-hour energy has a wide variety of flavors. There's something for everyone. When I used to stroll into a gas station in the morning on my way to my old day job, I'd grab a 5-hour energy. And back then, it was just basically berry and grape flavors. They're classic, but 5-hour energy's leveled up in the years since. 17 flavors, right? Peach mango has taken my top spot with its sweet tropical flavor that's just going to take me away. And I definitely want to try that confetti craze flavor, that sweet birthday cake inspired flavor with buttery, freshly baked confetti cake, vanilla frosting, and that sprinkle of sweetness in every sip. So who's number one on your board? Find out and find your new flavor. I have 5-hour energy shots available online at 5hourenergy.com or on Amazon. And the pressure is high in the NFL, and so it is in your workplace, with deadlines, overflowing inboxes, and that one position that you have to fill sitting open. When the pressure is on, you need the right hire, and Indeed is all you need. Indeed Sponsored Jobs is going to help you reach the right people who are actually fit what you're looking for, with those right skills, experience, and location. So you're not just hoping to stumble across the right candidate, as they stumble across your posts, right? Over the next minute that I'm sitting here talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. You can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. So we thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And the off season doesn't exist for the everydayers, and especially for those in the Everydayer Club. You can join the Locked On Podcast Discord and talk Falcons as well as other teams all year round. And you can get every episode of the show ad-free. Just head on over to the link in the description at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. So this is a longer conversation, and we're going to do our best to kind of breeze through it in the next like 10 to 12 minutes, right? And if you need further explanations on where I'm coming from on this, I'll be happy to do so in the comments here on YouTube. You can send me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Hit me up in either the Locked On Falcons or Locked On Podcast Network Discord, or of course in the Locked On Falcons Insider Program, link in description below. So we're going to focus primarily on the offense here when we talk about this, talking about, the why the roster was not as good, because I don't think anybody is really arguing that the defense was poorly coached this past season. Right, we can certainly criticize certain games from Jeff Ulbrich and game plans. I'm looking at you, Week 11 against the Panthers, but for the most part, the defensive issues were personnel and roster related. Right, basically the biggest criticism you could have for the coaching is the month of trying to make fetch happen when they trotted out JD Bertrand in Divine Diablo's absence. But again, I feel like that's much more of an issue of just the Falcons not having good linebacker depth and more of a roster issue than necessarily terrible coaching on the part of this coaching staff. And then you look at the 10 games where the CB2 was a liability. Again, that's poor roster building, because we've been complaining about that revolving door, needing to stop that revolving door at CB2 for basically 5 years. So I hope, I don't have to explain why I'm skipping over talking about the defense when we talk about this and just solely focusing on the offense. But, basically the main reasons why I think coaching was not nearly as bad and it was more of a roster issue is due to, and why the coaching I think is probably better than what people consider it, is basically the Falcons' 3 best players all had career years: Bijan, Drake, Kyle, right? Bijan All-Pro, Kyle Pitts All-Pro. Drake London, had he been healthy for the entire season, probably would have been an All-Pro, was basically performing like a top 5 wide receiver for that 8-week stretch from week 4 to week 11 when he was at his healthiest during the season. And had he continued on that way, probably would have been an All-Pro. And, I'm sure plenty of people would argue that's more a reflection of those guys, talents than necessarily any good coaching. I would disagree with that, because we've seen what great talent looks like with poor coaching. We see that with the Eagles every other season, right? And particularly this past year, right? Where you just look at their main weapons, right? Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith. None of those guys played poorly this year, right? All had 1,000-yard seasons, but by their standards, those guys' standards, they were all kind of middle-of-the-road seasons for them career-wise. And so when you're contrasting the Eagles' 3 stars with having middle-of-the-road seasons with the Falcons' 3 stars all playing at a career-best level, to me, that's a clear example that one staff is not getting the most out of their players, and then the other staff is getting maybe not the most, but a lot more out of their players. And so therefore saying, oh, they're poorly coached is, not necessarily true. Now, not everyone on this offense overachieved or lived up to the expectations that they had, like Bijan, Drake, and Kyle, right? There was plenty of players that underachieved on offense, right? We're looking at quarterback. We're looking at pretty much every wide receiver not named Drake London. And we're also looking at the offensive line. But when we look at the offensive line and those wide receivers, we can blame a lot of that on injuries, right? Not poor coaching, right? The lack of depth that we had at those positions, right? That's a roster issue. Right, we go back to March when we were complaining on this podcast about the Falcons running it back with basically the same offensive line minus Drew Dahlman. And I'm sure many of you guys were listening to me complain about re-signing Brandon Parker and Kyle Hinton and being like, oh, that's just Aaron being a hater and always nitpicking and all that stuff. And then those problems wound up biting them in the butt once Caleb McGarry got injured, right? And undermined their offensive line, right? We've been talking for 3 years on this podcast, basically since I've been making my trip down to Mobile for the Senior Bowl starting in 2023, talking about drafting an offensive tackle, and the Falcons were like, nope, we're going to keep punting on that position. And then they finally did it this year with a 3-year project in Jack Nelson that was not going to help them out, right? And so, again, that's a roster issue. Then we look at the wide receiver position, right? The Falcons coaches, you can say the coaches trusted way too much in the depth, but again, going back to that earlier point, having far too much faith that Terry Fontenot had built a great roster, right? Mooney goes down, first day of training camp. They bring in DJ Chark, and they're like, don't worry, we don't have to worry about this. Casey Washington David Sills, Chris Blair, Nick Nash, Raven McLeod, they're all going to step up. McLeod was gone by October. Kadero Hodge was basically a non-factor in the offense. They refused to play him outside of one game against the Dolphins, right? Nick Nash and Chris Blair were stuck on a practice squad. Nash is no longer on the team, right? Casey Washington was a healthy scratch for the last half of the season. And basically the only player that actually stepped up, and we're really exaggerating if we're saying what David Sills did in the last month of the season was stepping up, he's the only guy. And so to me, that owes to poor roster building. But we'll circle back to the wide receiver a little bit later. Now, let's talk about the quarterback situation. I think this is the crux of where and why people sit here and blame coaching, because a lot of people look at the underperformance of Michael Penix this year and say that's on coaching, right? I think a lot of people blame that on, the Falcons' overuse of pistol, underuse of under center offense, right? And I think it's a fair criticism to say that the Falcons did that. I think sort of trying to sit here and go like that's the reason why Michael Penix wasn't good this year, I think is extremely overblown. But I do plan on doing a much more in-depth discussion of that at a later date, hopefully in the next few days or weeks here on the podcast. So I'm not going to go deeply into that. But to me, when I look back at Michael Penix's 2025 season, to me, it so exactly mirrors the Desmond Ritter's 2023 season, right? We saw Penix flash potential late in his rookie season, just like we saw Desmond Ridder do. And we thought, he's going to pick up where he left off going into his first full year as a starter, right? I'll happily admit I was drinking the Kool-Aid on Desmond Ridder back in 22 and 23, right? Thinking, he can be an effective game manager, with this elite run game that the Falcons are going to have this upcoming season with Bijan and Algier and this offensive line. And then the run game fell off a cliff and Ridder crashed and burned. And I remember after that 23 season, so many Falcon fans were echoing the same thing you're hearing. We're saying the same thing about Desmond Ridder that you're also hearing about Michael Penix, right? Arthur Smith and Dave Ragone did a terrible job developing Desmond Ridder. Now, I never said this, but other people said this. And now we kind of know 2+ years later, no, they didn't really do a terrible job. Desmond Ridder just wasn't that good. And the reality with Michael Penix is we're going to have probably a better idea in 2+ years that whether or not Michael Penix is good. And when we look back at this 2025 season, we'll know sort of, did he underachieve based off of his performance, or did the coaches let him down? And the problem why we can't say that definitively right now is because Penix got injured, right? I remember we had a conversation with Matt Waldman, the rookie scouting portfolio we do in the summer. It was like, how many games do you need to know if you got a good quarterback? And he basically said roughly 16. Penix got hurt in his 12th start, right? 3, counting the 3 in his rookie year. And so we were basically a month away from knowing, at least having a better idea definitively on whether Penix was the answer, right? It would be the same equivalent if you go back to that 23 season. You remember Desmond Ritter's roughly his 12th start was that Titans game. That was the game he got benched. But imagine an alternate reality where instead of getting benched in that game, he gets injured and doesn't play the rest of the season, right? And we would be sitting there wondering for the rest of the year, is Desmond Ridder good? And we wouldn't find out till much later, until the 2024 season. But fortunately for the Falcons back then, Ridder was able to come off of that benching, and then basically 4 games later or 5 games later, whatever it was, plays against the Buccaneers. And that was the game, if you were an everyday of this podcast, where we realized, okay, I don't think this Desmond Ridder thing is going to work out, right? And so it's hard to sit here and say, without having those extra games, that extra month or 2 of Penix's performances, to really say with any amount of conviction, whether it's the quarterback, whether it's the coaching, right? It just might be that Michael Penix is just not that good, but we'll find out, right? And I'm certainly not going to blame, the shotgun, the pistol, the lack of under center, because Michael Penix is a shotgun pistol quarterback, right? Over 90% of his snaps in college were in the shotgun or pistol, right? But and the Falcons were betting on continuing that shotgun and pistol usage would smooth his transition to the NFL. The other thing that the Falcons were betting on was that his ability as a vertical passer was going to unlock the full potential of this battle station, right? Of this offense. And all offseason, we talked about how Penix's ability to push the ball down the field really could raise the ceiling for what this offense could be and deliver on that top 5, top 10 type of offensive potential that they have, in theory, with a bombs away offense, with the weapons that they have and the quarterback that they have and all that stuff. And they didn't deliver on that. Penix didn't deliver on that. Penix was the NFL's worst vertical passer in 2025. according to PFF, on 20-plus yard throws. You look at his adjusted completion rate, right, which factors in drops and other factors. He was dead last in the NFL on those deep passes. Now, do I think that's a reflection of Penix's ability? No, I think it's not that Penix can't throw deep. It's just he didn't throw deep well in 2025. I think we know he's very capable of being an effective deep ball thrower, or at least a more effective deep ball thrower than dead last in the NFL. And so when we look at why he was dead last in the NFL, I think that goes back to the conversation we're having about the wide receivers, right? Because you know who was also near the bottom of the NFL in adjusted completion rate on deep passes in 2025? Kirk Cousins, after being top 5 in that same metric in 2024. And as we've said so many times on this podcast over the last year or two, that so much of their 2024 success on offense was, hey, Drake London and or Darnell Mooney is open down there somewhere, and they were able to exploit that. And we saw Darnell Mooney going from number 2 in the NFL in 2024 in explosive plays, number 2 in completion rate on deep passes, 20-plus yard throws in 2024 to nothing in 2025, right? And so if you want to boil down the Falcons' downfall in 2025 to one thing, and I'm not saying it's the only reason, but if you're going to rank them 1 through 5, 1 through 10, whatever, number 1, in my humble opinion, is Darnell Mooney's fall off. It is the fall off of the wide receiver position. That Mooney was a no-show this past season. Drake London missed half the season, and you went from a team that had a top 3 wide receiver duo that really carried this offense in 2024 to basically those guys being non-existent. Again, where they rank in terms of wide receiver duos, but it was not high. It was near the bottom, right? You can look at that and look at other metrics to see that. Their success rate against man coverage, some of the top, both for Mooney and Drake, some of the best in the NFL in 2024, near the bottom of the league in 2025. And, you know, I don't think those issues are all about play calling or coaching. I think it's a lot about execution. Now, it's not 100% on the players, right? Certainly, some of it could be owed to maybe some stale route combinations from Zach Robinson, particularly early in the season, which may or may not have led to Ike Hilliard's dismissal, from what I've been told, right? And him being called out, Zach Robinson being called out, and the head coach being like, I'm going to side with the OC instead of the wide receivers coach. So at least what I've been told, right? But when we look at Zach Robinson, our guy, you know, our savior, Z-Rob Zealots, that we were so here. We wanted to see Z-Rob deliver 2 main areas, right? We wanted to see him get more out of Kyle Pitts than he did in 2024. He delivered on that, even though when him delivering all came in games where Drake London was a non-factor. And we also want to see him deliver on the play action passing, and he vastly improved that, right? Falcons play action was the worst in the NFL in 2024. For the first month of the season in 2025, they were still the worst. But then for like the last 12 games of the season, they were top 3, top 5. So I look at that and I go, Zach Robinson was objectively a better play caller in 2025 than he was in 2024. I think that also applies to the entire coaching staff, right? Going from Jimmy Lake to Jeff Ulbrich, Raheem's game management issues still sprung up in 2025 from time to time, but not nearly to the degree that I thought they showed in 2024. It was really cost the Falcons games, right? So I think collectively the coaching was better in 2025 than it was in 2024. But it wasn't good enough for the Falcons to reach their goal. That's certainly, and that goal being the playoffs. And to me, the reason I think is because I don't think the roster is as cracked up as it is to be, right? I'm not saying the roster is trash. It's a good enough roster to make the playoffs, but it's probably only good enough to make the playoffs in the NFC South, right? Now, maybe in a couple of other divisions, they could finish in the second place. I'm looking at you, NFC East. But for most divisions around the NFL, this is probably a third or fourth place team. And we're going to continue today's episode drilling down on why this perception that this Falcons roster is incredible, why that exists, and what this regime, in my opinion, has to do to actually live up to that hype of having this great roster. And we'll do that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons.
Hey, it's Matt Derry from the Locked On Lions podcast. The people I love depend on me. If I'm gone, the financial responsibilities don't disappear. I didn't want my family figuring things out during the hardest moment of their lives. That's why I knew only one place to go. I chose life insurance through my friends at Ethos. Ethos makes getting life insurance fast and easy, 100% online. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in minutes, and get same-day coverage. There's no medical exam. You just answer a few simple health questions. You can get up to $3 million in coverage. Some policies are as low as $30 a month. I love the folks at Ethos. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos now by going to ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. In as little as 10 minutes, you can get the free quote and up to $3 million in coverage at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Application times and rates may vary.
So I think it's pretty basic why people perceive the Falcons have a great roster. And, I heard it stated the other day, which confirmed what I thought was true, but I wasn't 100% certain. But, they were the first team in NFL history to have drafted 4 offensive skill players in the top 10 in 4 consecutive drafts. And I think that's what fuels why people think this roster is loaded, as PT Cornelius would say, right? We're loaded because the positions that people care about are quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end because of fantasy football, right? And it's not to say that the rest of the Falcons roster is bad, but there's nothing special about them relative to other NFL teams. But because fantasy football has such a tremendous grip on, the mindset of fans, it skews perception on how you build a roster, right? Because real football isn't like fantasy football, right? In fantasy football, hey, just collect the best quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, and you'll be prosper. And you'll prosper as a football team. But real football doesn't work that way. You hear Jarvis Davis talk about this all the time on the podcast, right? Real football is won and lost in the trenches, right? You talk about Jarvis talking about, how this team was built wrong, outside in versus inside out. That's what Jarvis is talking about. This focus on the fantasy football positions rather than, the trenches, right? Mix it up. And to me, if this new regime is going to have more success than the previous regimes, whether we're talking about Raheem Morris, whether we're talking about Arthur Smith and others, they're going to have to build it better. And, that potentially starts in the trenches. We talked about this on Mock Draft Monday when we talked about the Falcons selecting Georgia defensive tackle Kristen Miller in round 2 in a mock draft that we broke down then. And you've heard me say multiple times over the last weeks, I don't think D tackle is a pressing need for the Falcons. But I'm certainly not against the idea of taking a D tackle in round 2, especially if you can land a top 5 D tackle in this particular draft class that has a real chance to potentially move the needle for you at that position. If you're not going to land one of those guys, then, for me, I'd probably wait on that. But, Kristen Miller is one of those potential top 5 guys. And so that's what we believe in building in the trenches. And we're optimistic on the opposite side of the ball that this new regime is going to deliver. Kevin Stefanski with the run game and building the offensive line and rebuilding, revamping, whatever you want to call it. Bijan, Bill Callahan, right? They'll continue to be one of the top run games in the NFL. But if that continues, that's not really moving the needle ahead for this football team, right? For the last 4 years combined, you look at success rate, the Falcons are a top 8 rushing team, right? Now, maybe they go from 8th to 3rd over the next 4 years under Kevin Stefanski. But what is that going to do? Is it going to win them one more game? And again, in the NFC South, hey, that's going to win you the division, but that ain't going to move the needle much else against other teams outside this division. And so to me, when I look at this regime, I think their success hinges on 3 things: play calling, wide receiver play, and quarterback play. Why those 3? Because someone has to make you right. We've talked about this. The OC needs to either make you right because he can scheme open the first read. The wide receiver needs to be able to make you right because whether he's the first or second read, he's going to get open. And then the quarterback potentially has to make you right? Because if the wide receiver doesn't get open and the play doesn't work, then he has to create off structure. Now, on that latter point, that's not something that Michael Penix does well. We've talked before about he's probably never going to do that well. Maybe he can get better at that to the point where he's functional, but it's never going to be a strength of his. And while we don't have enough evidence to firmly say how good a play caller Tommy Rees is, I think it's fair to be skeptical based off of his body of work on whether or not he can deliver like the top guys do when it comes to consistently being able to scheme open that first read. And so when I look at this team's future on offense, in addition to the run game, my hopes are pinned on, hey, we got to get these weapons right. Get better weapons. We've seen it work in 2024. We saw it work from basically 2008 to 2020, right? With how great the Falcons' weapons were throughout that period of time during Matt Ryan's heyday here in Atlanta. The problem with those teams is the rest of the team wasn't very good. The only thing that was good about the team was the quarterback and the weapons, right? And so hopefully this time they will build a more round-rounded team, right? And you look at the weapons that Stefanski had in Cleveland and Minnesota, veteran receivers did well. Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham Jr., Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy. So I feel like Drake London's going to blossom here. It's really the young guys that didn't really develop in those places. And I don't think that's all on Kevin Stefanski. I think the Browns bet too much on mid and late round wide receivers because, again, they traded away their early round picks to get a quarterback that didn't necessarily make them right. And while continuing to bet on mid and late round wide receivers is not a bad bet, we'd love to see the Falcons draft the next Amon-Ra St. Brown, the next Puka Nacua, the next Antonio Brown. You're probably going to win more of those bets if you draft those weapons in the early rounds. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there, Aaron, well, if you think it's all about the weapons, why are you so quick to get rid of Kyle Pitts? Explained it the other day when we were talking about tagging Kyle Pitts. Drake London and Kyle Pitts don't really work well together, right? And that's why we get to the idea of this collection of talent being far exceeding the actual reality, right? With Drake London and Kyle Pitts, you think 1 + 1 = 2, but the reality with those two guys is this 1 + 1 = 1. And so you're not getting the most bang for your buck, despite all the talent that both of those guys have, because as I explained the other day on the podcast, both of those guys don't shine because they basically fulfill the same function in your offense. So I'm not trying to sit here and say that the Falcons will solve all their problems if they just get better wide receivers, right? Again, that's the narrative that other fans and other people and podcasters present you, that this team is 1 or 2 problems away from solving all their problems. I think they got to improve across the board. Quarterback, weapons, O-line, defense. And when we say defense, we're talking about all 3 levels. So it's not really, we lump it under one category, but it's really 3 problems. So depending on how you count it, right, this Falcon team has anywhere between 4 and 6 problems. The problem with Terry Fontenot was he always thought this team only had 1 problem. And that, to me, is the root of this team's downfall. So those are my thoughts on it. If I have to be the bad guy, if I got to be the fake fan, I got to be the hater that's going to tell you the truth about the real problems of the Falcons, and so be it, right? That's where the AKAs come from. But, you know, we're serious on this podcast, Serious Black. Sometimes you got to eat your vegetables, the Jolly Green Giant, right? Mr. Drew comes out, that negative Nancy. Yeah, he comes out quite a bit on this podcast. And then, of course, the iron that sharpens the iron, because, you know, my peers, my fellow podcasters, my fellow YouTubers, you know, we got to force them to step their game up, right? Because they're not telling you the truth. So that's going to do it for us here. Tomorrow we'll be doing the Stay or Go series, pass or pay, whatever you want to call it, on D. Alford, another impending Falcons free agent. So that will be our next episode. But if you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, members only Discord access, and so much more by heading to the link in the description at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.